We're back in the swing of things with 5 bold fantasy football predictions for Week 13 of the NFL season. We're going to start out with the Philadelphia Eagles and say Saquon Barkley as his biggest fantasy game of the season on Black Friday. Matchup 2 8-3 teams, the Bears and the Eagles in Philly on Friday afternoon. Got Philly looking to bounce back after blowing that 21-0 lead last week. The Bears looking to stay, I guess, hot. They just keep winning. I'm not sure how this keeps happening, but I want to keep the focus on Saquon here. Last week, the Eagles went with this pass-heavy attack. Saquon carried it only 10 times for 22 yards. Did catch 7 passes for 52 yards, so bailed you out in full PPR. But it was another in a long line of just overall disappointing games for Saquon this season. The Eagles are a team, though, that tends to overcorrect week to week. One game, they're throwing it all over the place. The next game, they're pounding Barkley 22 times. I think this could be one of those games. The Bears defense, they've come up with somewhat lucky stops, timely turnovers throughout this 7-1 stretch. But it's not a unit I trust overall. It's the same unit that gave up 42 to the Bengals not that long ago, 431 yards to the New York Giants, nearly 200 rushing yards to the Steelers last week. And this is the first time since week 6 that the Bears have faced a quality offense with a plus starter at quarterback. Over the last 6 games, they played Spencer Rattler, Tyler Huntley, Joe Flacco, Jaxson Dart, who was beating them, and then gave way to Russell Wilson, J.J. McCarthy, and Mason Rudolph. Only one of those guys will be starting for his team this season, and that's Jaxson Dart. Even with the Eagles once again struggling with their offensive identity, I don't like this matchup one bit for the Bears defense, which ranks 22nd in rush defense EPA, 26th in success rate, 29th in yards per carry allowed to running backs. We'll say the Eagles, even if Lane Johnson isn't out there, get back to doing what they do best. Saquon Barkley has his biggest fantasy game of the season, topping his 33.4 PPR points back in week 8 against the Giants. All right, sticking in the NFC East. Bold prediction number 2, Jaxson Dart. He returns and he ends the Patriots winning streak. So first off, let me say, I am now a believer in the New England Patriots. I was skeptical initially. The schedule is what it is, but look, winning 9 games in a row in the NFL, I don't care who you are, what the schedule has been, it's not an easy task. The Pats haven't lost since September 21st. That was the 5 turnover game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. The other loss, of course, came back in week 1 against Vegas. Just one of the head scratchers of the year. Anyway, the Pats have looked a little bit shaky lately, despite continuing to win games. They hung on to beat the Falcons. They struggled with the Bengals last week. Those games are going to happen, but for as good as the Pats are, they're still not a team that I would consider a true wagon at this point. They have some injuries stacking up on the offensive line. Will Campbell's going to miss some time. Jared Wilson, one of their starting guards, he's going to be out this week. I think the door might be open for the Giants to walk into Foxborough and steal this game. They get Jaxson Dart back this week, and maybe that lowers their potential through the air. Jameis did just lead an offense that piled up over 500 yards last week against Detroit. But overall, Dart is still the more dangerous player, given what he can do on the ground. Patriots bottom 5 in the NFL in terms of yards per carry allowed to quarterbacks this season. And whether it's Dart or Winston, the Giants have been an offense all year that's looking to generate chunk plays. They had 10 passing plays of 20-plus yards last week. On the season, they've generated 49 plays of 20-plus yards. That's the 5th most in the NFL. They've also been able to get the running game going over these last few games, even without Cam Scatterbo. Realistically, the Giants, they know their season's over. New England still very much playing for the 1 seed in the AFC. I think the Giants come into this game with nothing to lose. Maybe the Patriots sitting a little bit bad and happy right now. We'll say Jaxson Dart makes his return. He accounts for at least 3 touchdowns in an upset win for the Giants. All right, bold prediction number 3. We're really getting into it here. We're going to say Max Brosmer steps in and saves Justin Jefferson's fantasy stock, at least for a week. So this is partially about Brosmer, partially about Jefferson, maybe more so about J.J. McCarthy. Realistically, it's tough to overstate how bad McCarthy was last week against Green Bay. I mean, that was truly rock bottom. 12 of 19 for 87 yards, 5 sacks for negative 35 yards in sack yardage, 2 picks, 17.9 QBR, bottom 1 percentile EPA per dropback. In his 5 starts overall this season, McCarthy has a negative 9.2 completion percentage over expected. Easily the worst mark in the league. Cam Ward, for reference, is at negative 5.2%. Bo Nix, negative 2.4%. If you watched any part of that game on Sunday, all those numbers check out. McCarthy's struggles have also had a direct impact, of course, on Justin Jefferson, on TJ Hawkinson, on Jordan Addison. Jefferson specifically, over the last 3 games, has posted 7.7, 11.1, 8.8 PPR points. He ranks as the wide receiver 45 in average production in that span, behind names like Mac Hollins, John Mechie, Pat Bryant. You probably weren't benching Justin Jefferson, but depending on your roster, it's at least been a consideration given what we've seen. So we look ahead now to week 13. Pressure had already been building on JJ McCarthy after bad games against Baltimore and Chicago. I think at this point it's fair to question, where he and the Vikings go from here, beyond the 2025 season. This was all spiraling toward a nightmare matchup on the road against one of the best defenses in the NFL in the Seattle Seahawks. However, we find out on Monday morning that McCarthy landed in concussion protocol after the Green Bay game. I'm assuming he's going to remain there. They're keeping the door open as I record this for McCarthy to potentially play. I think we're going to see Max Brosmer on Sunday in Seattle. Now, we've heard plenty of positive whispers about Brosmer back in training camp in the preseason. There were even some reports out of Minnesota that they wanted to get a look at him at some point this year. Well, it looks like they're going to get their chance. So if we assume Brosmer is going to start this week, the fact that this is a terrible matchup on the road against an elite defense, that remains. I'm not saying this is a good spot for Max Brosmer. So we're keeping expectations tempered for him as well as the pass catchers. But based on what we've seen the last few weeks, and particularly on Sunday at Lambeau Field, the current bar for Vikings quarterback play is basically set as low as it can get. By default, it will be very difficult for Max Brosmer to be any worse than JJ McCarthy was a week ago. We're going to say Max Brosmer, he keeps the Vikings offense afloat. He does just enough to push Justin Jefferson to 15 plus fantasy points on Sunday. And I think we might have a very interesting quarterback controversy starting to brew in Minneapolis. Bold prediction number 4, Jacoby Brissett becomes just the latest quarterback to shred the Tampa Bay Buccaneers secondary. So first and foremost, the Bucs have lost 3 in a row. They've lost 4 out of 5. The injuries all over that offense feel like they're starting to take their toll. But the defense has also collapsed of late. Gave up 435 and 28 points to New England, 414 and 44 points to Buffalo, 333 yards, 34 points to the Rams in a game that was over midway through the second quarter. The Bucs are now a bottom 10 pass defense on the season. They've handed out 250 plus yard days to 6 different quarterbacks, including Michael Penix, all the way back in week 1. The Bucs run defense still among the best in the NFL, so facing heavy passing volume maybe is part of the equation here. But on the season, the Bucs are giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. If we look at just the last 3 games, they're dead last in fantasy production to QBs at just a hair under 30 fantasy points per game. They're also giving up 41.3 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That's the 3rd most in the NFL. Facing Drake May, Josh Allen, Matthew Stafford, yeah, it's a big part of the reason. But the Bucs now get a pass-happy Cardinals team led by Jacoby Brissett, who's averaged 315 passing yards per game since taking over for Kyler Murray. Over the last 3 games alone, he's attempted 44, 57, and 49 passes. I fully expect Arizona to test that Buccaneers secondary once again. And frankly, I'm not sure how it's going to hold up against an elite tight end and Trey McBride and this group of kind of cast-off wide receivers who Brissett has found a way to connect with. We'll say Jacoby Brissett remains very much a viable fantasy starter this week. He once again throws the ball at least 40 times and puts up what would be his 3rd consecutive 300-yard game on that Bucs secondary. Last but not least, our 5th bold prediction for NFL Week 13, Devin Neal finishes the week as a top 10 fantasy running back. All right, so we're not getting too wild here. We're probably looking at a minimum of 16, 17 fantasy points in full PPR to finish as a top 10 back this week, which I think is very doable for Devin Neal. We're presuming that he'll step in for Alvin Kamara, who of course went out with a knee injury last week against Atlanta. Kendre Miller is out for the season. Audric Estime is the other option right now in New Orleans. Neal's been in the mix for the last month or so behind Alvin Kamara. Took basically every running back snap last week after Kamara went out. Finished with only 7 carries for 18 yards, but did tack on 5 catches for 43 yards. The receiving is the big appeal here. He had 3 catches against Carolina, 3 against Tampa Bay, all in a limited snap share. And rightfully, we can question the overall upside of the Saints offense, but they do get a pretty tasty matchup this week against Miami. Bottom 10 fantasy defense against running backs. They're giving up 4.9 yards per carry, 7 yards per reception to the running back position. Miami also gives up the highest catch rate to running backs at 90% on the year. League average closer to 75, 77%. The one thing that worries me, the Taysom Hill factor. That does loom very large here. You just know we're going to get way more Taysom Hill in this game than we'd like. I still think the workload should be there for Neal. This is a game New Orleans should be able to keep competitive, but either way, I expect Devin Neal to be involved as a runner and in the passing game. If he can find the end zone here, I think he can reach that fantasy point threshold to finish as a top 10 back this week.